She didn't realize when it started, the slow habit of making herself small. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It began quietly, the way people learn to whisper when they forget they're allowed to speak. She was always available, always helpful, always ready to comfort, solve, assist. She knew how to show up for everyone, except herself. They called her strong, dependable, selfless. But deep down, she felt invisible. She didn't call it loneliness. She called it responsibility. She didn't call it exhaustion. She called it love. She didn't call it emotional neglect. She called it being a good person. But slowly, service became silence. And silence began to cost her pieces she never learned to ask back for. She carried everyone's burdens, but never spoke of her own. She dried other people's tears, but never let herself cry. She stayed up late talking someone else out of their pain, but couldn't remember the last time someone asked her, "How are you really doing?" She filled her days with tasks, her mind with expectations, until her own needs felt like an inconvenience. She wasn't angry. She didn't resent anyone. She just believed somehow that caring for herself was selfish. She thought love meant absence of desire. She thought faith meant absence of boundaries. She thought kindness meant being endlessly available to the world, even when her heart was running on empty. But the more she gave, the less she felt present. People knew her name, but not her story. They saw her strength, but not her weariness. They embraced her loyalty, but not her longing. And eventually, she felt like a guest in her own life, always on standby, always fine, always apologizing for needing anything at all. One quiet night, after everyone had gone to sleep, she sat on the edge of her bed and whispered a confession she had never spoken aloud. "I don't remember how to exist without proving that I deserve to be here." That moment changed everything, not because she found the answers, but because she found the courage to ask the question. What if love wasn't meant to erase her? What if strength didn't mean silence? What if service wasn't supposed to cost her the very person God created her to be? That night she realized something sacred. If God gave her breath, He must have intended her to live, not just serve, not just survive, not just help everyone else build their lives, while forgetting to care for her own. So she made a decision. Not loud, not heroic, but revolutionary. She would stop apologizing for existing, not by abandoning kindness, but by believing that loving others and loving herself didn't need to be enemies. They could be neighbors. They could be siblings. They could be holy. And for the first time in a long time, she wondered, what would happen if I stopped protecting the world and started protecting my soul? This is where her story begins. And maybe this is where yours begins too. She didn't choose silence in one single moment. It happened over time, in small decisions, in swallowed words, in kind gestures that carried secret pain. It began with her wanting to help. She believed that love meant being useful, that faith meant being agreeable, that kindness meant belonging to everyone but herself. At first, people thanked her. They praised her for her maturity, her patience, her generosity. She felt seen, or at least needed. And for a while, that was enough. But over the years, helping others became easier than speaking honestly about her own heart. She learned how to say, "I'm fine," even when she felt anything but fine. She learned how to listen deeply, but never share deeply. She learned how to fill the silence for others, while leaving her own chambers untouched. Serving began as love, but slowly became something else, a language of disappearance. She wasn't just showing up for people, she was hiding behind them. The more she gave, the less she felt allowed to receive. The more she helped, the less she felt permitted to need help. People said she was strong, but her strength was often just exhaustion wearing a polite smile. She began to notice that when someone praised her for being so selfless, something in her tightened. Selfless. Does that mean without self? Does that mean invisible? Does that mean that her presence was only valuable when she ignored her own heart? In moments of loneliness, she asked herself quietly, if I stopped helping, would anyone stay? And she feared the answer. So she kept serving, kept smiling, kept disappearing, in the name of love. She thought God wanted her to give everything. But what she didn't know was that God never asked her to disappear. Jesus washed feet, but he never erased his presence. He served, but he did not surrender his voice. He poured himself out, but not as an apology. That truth took time to reach her. But as soon as it did, something sacred happened. She began to question the silence, to wonder if loving others could coexist with loving herself, to believe that service should never cost her the dignity of being seen. It was a small awakening, but it was real, and it was holy. Because naming silence was the beginning of finding her voice again. It didn't happen in a breakdown. It didn't come with tears or shouting or dramatic goodbyes. It came in the smallest moment, one that looked ordinary from the outside. She was washing dishes. The house was quiet. Everyone had been taken care of. Dinner had been made. Another need had been met. Another day had been survived. And then, for no particular reason, she stopped. She turned off the water, sat in a chair, and felt something unexpected. A heavy, honest exhaustion she could no longer argue with. She wasn't angry. She wasn't resentful. She was simply tired. Not the tiredness that sleep cures, but the kind that follows the soul when it's been ignored too long. She felt it in her shoulders, in her quiet sighs, in the way joy was no longer natural but something she had to schedule. She used to think fatigue was normal, but this wasn't ordinary fatigue. This was her heart telling the truth. I have carried too much for too long. She looked back at her life and saw 1,000 moments where she kept going even when her spirit begged her to rest. Every time she said yes, even when her heart whispered, please, not now. Every time she smiled while something inside her was silently collapsing. She had called it strength, maturity, purpose, but it was just silence wearing the clothes of service. She wondered, is it possible to love others without abandoning myself? That thought seemed selfish, until it began to feel honest. On that night, alone in a quiet house, she let herself admit it. She was tired of apologizing for needing rest. She was tired of excusing her needs as if they were mistakes. She was tired of living as if her worth depended on how much she could give. It was a quiet confession, but it changed everything. Not because she had a plan, not because she suddenly found confidence, but because for the first time in years, she listened to her exhaustion instead of silencing it. She allowed herself to exist not as a servant, but as a soul. A human soul, with breath, with limits, with value, with permission to rest. And on that day, she didn't become selfish. She became seen. She became heard. She became real. It was the day she realized that admitting her tiredness was not the end of love, but one of its beginnings. She always waited for someone to say it was okay to rest, okay to take a step back, okay to make space for her own dreams, even if no one else was asking about them. She waited for permission, but no one knew she needed it, because no one knew how heavy her silence had become. She wondered why love felt like a duty instead of delight, why kindness felt like survival instead of joy, why she felt more like a caretaker than a daughter, more like a servant than a soul. She prayed for strength, but what she really needed was permission. Permission to feel, to breathe, to ask, to be. It felt wrong at first, to listen to her own heart, to consider that her needs might matter too, that her rest might be sacred, not selfish, that maybe God didn't make her a vessel just to be emptied, but to be cared for, filled, loved. She didn't want attention. She wanted acceptance, not applause, just room to exist without earning it. Somewhere deep inside, she felt a quiet invitation forming, not from the world, not from her fears, but from God Himself. Rest, daughter, not because you've done enough, but because you are loved enough. It wasn't a command. It wasn't an obligation. It was permission. Permission to slow down, permission to breathe, permission to be seen, and not just for what she could offer. In that moment, she realized something sacred. There are seasons where God heals by holding, not by using. Seasons where His love doesn't demand movement, but offers shelter. So she said it quietly, to herself, to her fear, to the mirror. I don't need permission to exist. And something in her shifted, not loudly, not instantly, but deeply, like roots beginning to grow where she once believed nothing could survive. She didn't stop serving. She just began learning how to serve with dignity, how to love without disappearing, how to live without apologizing for needing space, time, rest, and compassion, even for herself. That was the permission she never asked for, and the one her soul had been waiting to receive. She had spent years believing that love meant stepping aside, letting others speak first, letting others choose first, letting others feel, while she held everything together. She thought compassion required her disappearance. That kindness was proven by how quietly she could suffer. That holiness meant never saying, I need help. So she gave and gave and gave, until even she forgot she was human. But one day, while listening to someone share their heart, she felt something unexpected, almost unfamiliar, the desire to speak, not to interrupt, not to correct, but to be known. Her voice felt like a stranger, but a gentle one. She held it carefully, like something sacred that she wasn't ready to lose again. And slowly she began to realize, love never asked her to disappear. Fear did that. Expectation did that. But not love. Not the kind that heals. Not the kind that protects. Not the kind that looks like Jesus. Jesus washed feet, but He did not erase His presence. He served, but He also rested. He gave, but He also received. He poured Himself out, but always returned to the Father to be filled again. That truth changed how she saw everything. God wasn't asking her to disappear for others. He was asking her to reflect His love, the kind that doesn't remove identity, but restores it. She started asking herself a new question. What if service doesn't mean silence? What if devotion doesn't mean depletion? What if love is strongest when it allows me to exist fully, not hide quietly? For the first time, she saw her presence not as a threat to love, but as a part of it. Because love is not proven by disappearance. It is proven by authenticity. The kind of authenticity that breathes, feels, speaks, asks, and still believes in goodness. She didn't abandon kindness. She just learned to practice it both ways, toward others and toward herself. And once she understood that, she didn't just serve better, she lived better. She loved deeper. She prayed more honestly. She showed up, not as a shadow, but as a soul. Love didn't need her absence. It needed her presence. And that presence was never a burden. It was a blessing that God Himself wanted her to carry. She used to wake up and wonder if today she would be useful enough to deserve her place in the world. Every morning began with a silent question. How can I earn my right to exist? But healing taught her something sacred. Existence was never hers to earn. It was something God gave her, before she could ever prove anything. She didn't stop loving others. She stopped disappearing to do it. She didn't stop serving. She stopped thinking that her worth depended on sacrifice. She didn't stop caring. She just learned to include herself in the circle of compassion she had always created for everyone else. This wasn't rebellion. It was reverence. It wasn't selfishness. It was stewardship. Because tending to her soul was not a rejection of love. It was a reflection of it. She began to see life differently. Not as a stage where she must perform, but as a garden where she is meant to grow. Not as a test to pass, but as a gift to receive. She started saying words she once thought were forbidden. I need rest. I need help. I need space. I need to feel safe in my own presence. And with every brave confession, she began to heal. Not because she stopped serving others, but because she finally allowed herself to be served by grace. She realized that God was not asking her to earn love with effort, but to live loved with honesty, with humanity, with breath that doesn't apologize for continuing. Now, when she walks into a room, she does not shrink. She does not scan for judgment. She does not wait for permission. She breathes, long and deep, and whispers, I'm allowed to be here. Not because she feels confident, but because she finally understands existing is not arrogance. It is worship. A quiet, simple, sacred way to look toward heaven and say, thank you for letting me be alive today. I won't waste it by vanishing. Her presence became prayer. Her breath became testimony. Her existence became holy. And once she believed that, there was no need to apologize for living ever again.